coming into class, does anyone have questions over the e-portfolios or signature assignment and reflection paper? We talked about that at the beginning of class last time. If you went and you looked at the e-portfolio site, do you have any questions now or anything like that? All right, well, let's jump into, first off, we're going to be learning and reviewing a little bit about crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. So we talked about this last time, but we'll just do a quick review. Crystallized intelligence are those things that you accumulate over time. So if you've learned a new language, that's kind of added into your crystallized intelligence. You've learned a new skill, you've added more information, maybe you learned a lot about some other country's government or something like that. You're in a psych class, so you're adding information to your crystallized intelligence. So in middle adulthood, crystallized intelligence tends to just keep increasing. And this is really across the lifespan. Crystallized intelligence continues to increase. If you're an expert in an area, you probably have a lot of information and accumulated knowledge around that specific area you're an expert in, whether you're a mechanic or you're an artist or you're a researcher or you're a doctor. There's probably a lot of crystallized intelligence about that thing. So with that, you can continue to increase that. Fluid intelligence is a little bit different. It's the ability to reason abstractly, so you could think of that as thinking outside the box. So this might be easier to do if you're an expert in an area. You've already seen some solutions posed, seen people try to do things to solve certain problems, so you put those together in a new, different way. That can be easier with more crystallized intelligence, but fluid intelligence is that cognitive ability to think a little bit differently, think outside the box to solve novel problems. So fluid intelligence increases in middle adulthood, and then it might start to decline in late middle adulthood. We'll look at some longitudinal studies today about that. But one of the first things that we'll do is actually watch kind of a competition of fluid and crystallized intelligence between some people in early adulthood versus middle adulthood. So this video here will present them with a problem, basically a brain teaser. With this, you need to use both crystallized and fluid intelligence to solve this problem. So I'll present the problem to you in the video. I'll give you a couple minutes to think up your own solution of how you would solve this problem. And so with that, if you come up with a solution, put it in the chat, and then we'll watch what they reveal is the way to solve the problem. And then we'll see what everybody has answered. If you had the fluid intelligence to think outside the box and reason abstractly and figure out the solution to this problem. So let's do that now.
It's not all bad news. Research shows that some parts of the brain can actually improve with age, and we're about to put that theory to the test. Take a look at these 3 light bulbs. Each one is controlled by a different one of these switches.
All you have to do is figure out which switch corresponds with which bulb, and then label bulbs 1, 2, 3. The only problem is the switches are over here, and the bulbs are over here.
You can turn the switches on and off as much as you'd like, but since the bulbs are in the other room, you won't be able to see them as you flip the switches. Then you only get one shot to go down the hall and label the bulbs correctly.
So how would you figure out this problem?
So we'll watch a couple people try to figure out this problem, but I'll just describe it again and then give you some time to think of how you would solve it. So here on the other side of the wall or in a different room, you've got 3 switches. Each one of those switches corresponds to one of these light bulbs, but you don't know which light bulb it corresponds to. And the only time you can see the light bulb is after the switches have already been flipped. So you can flip the switches in whatever series you want. You can have them on or off as long as you want. You can stay on the other side of the wall with the switches basically and do whatever you want with those switches. But you can only come and see the light bulbs themselves one time. That one time you come and you look at them and you label them. So you need to be able to figure out which one is corresponding to which switch with just seeing them the one time. So you're in the room with the switches for as long as you want, then you come to the room with the light bulbs and you put your markers of, is it number 1, 2, or 3, and you don't go back to the switches. So you don't go back and forth. You just set the switches for doing whatever you want, then in the light bulbs doing whatever you want. So I'll give you about a minute, maybe a little more, to think of a solution yourself. Obviously, you need some crystallized intelligence to know how switches and light bulbs work. If you didn't know how light bulbs worked or you didn't experience them in your life, this would be a really hard problem to solve. You might not even comprehend the problem. But you'll need fluid intelligence to kind of think outside the box to figure out the solution. So I'll give you about a minute and I'll be quiet, even though that can be hard for me to do, and let you think of something. Once you think of something, put it in the meeting chat of how you would solve it. And then I won't respond to those chats until after we see the actual solution from the video, though. So we'll go back through what everybody has said. All right, so go for it. Think of how you'd solve that problem. Or also, if you have any questions, give me questions in the chat or turn on your mic so I can clarify the problem as well. So 3 switches, 3 light bulbs. You can flip the switches, and then you come see the light bulbs and label the light bulbs. All right, go for it. My mic was muted. So you've had a little more than a minute. Feel free to keep writing your responses. I see one in right now. Again, I won't respond to the comments yet. Think of your own solution. Don't use other people's to come up with your idea. And I'll tell you my idea of when I first heard this problem, what I would have done in just a minute. But let's watch the early adult sample and the middle adult sample work on this as you keep writing your response.
The truth is, you should be able to figure it out just as easily in your couch as if you were in this room. Now, while you think it over, we brought in some volunteers.
4 are in their early 20s, and 4 are 45 and older. We let them duke it out head to head. Who do you think will have more success figuring it out?
Rob, are you ready to try this?
I am.
Go to town.
See what happens over here. Put 2 on and 1. No, put 1. No, why would I want to put? Let's see what's 1. This number 3 on. 1. I don't know. Just put 2.
You're just guessing.
2 and 3 down. Yeah, I have no idea.
Rob is having a tough time with this challenge. Do you think everyone will struggle, or will some players have a flash of brilliance?
Can I have any hints?
No hints.
I'm going to shut this one off.
I'm thinking if I leave 1 and 3, no, because I don't know what order they're in.
Well, can I go look at the bulbs now?
If you think that gives you enough information to label all of them, then yes. So what are you going to turn on? Anything?
All right, I'll just put 2 and 3 on for now, and then.
And then you'll go and guess is what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take a shot in the dark.
Okay.
Do you think the older brain's experience and wisdom will lead to victory? Or will our young brains demonstrate creative outside-the-box thinking to crack this?
This is 1 or 2.
I don't know.
This one's warm. So this one is number 3.
This guy's on the right track. Do you think the others are getting any bright ideas?
100%.
Is that right?
If I'm wrong, I'm just wrong.
I think I got it. It looks good.
Before we reveal which team won, we're going to reveal the solution.
All right, so right before they reveal the solution, let's look at the solutions that have been posed. My option would have been pretty similar to Rob's the first time I heard this. I would leave one off, so then it's really clear which one was that one that was off. And then I would put 2 on, and hopefully I could guess out of those 2 which was correct. That was my initial solution the first time I thought of solving this problem, which, I mean, you could guess it right, but it's not really a great way to do it. So let's see, I still only see 1 comment here. So you could flip 1 switch on for 5 minutes, 1 for 3 minutes, and 1 for 1 minute. And when you go into the other room, feel how hot each of the light bulbs are. Whichever is hottest is the 5-minute one, and the coldest is the 1-minute one. So that would be one possible solution to the problem. And so that is really demonstrating the out-of-the-box thinking that I didn't do the first time I tried this, and that a lot of these early adults didn't do. Is you don't have to just use your eyes. You have other senses. There are other ways to tell which light bulbs were on for a period of time. So you could do that where you have all the light bulbs on and then try to determine like which one's a little hotter or a little colder. And you could do that if you could sense the temperature difference. And I think you could with like 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute. I think this, especially with incandescent lights, that would be easier to do that. If it was something like an LED light that is a little better at heat efficiency, that might be harder for that specific solution. But yeah, for the crystallized intelligence, knowing that's how incandescent lights work, I think that would work really well. So having them on at different amounts of time and being able to test the temperatures. And that out-of-the-box thinking that, hey, you could touch a light bulb is the kind of fluid intelligence you need to be able to solve this problem. So let's see the suggestion that they give, and it's really similar to this response.
Were you able to figure out how to correctly label each bulb? All you have to do is turn on 2 of the switches. Leave both on for about a minute. Then turn 1 off and go into the other room. 1 bulb will be on. 1 will be off. The 3rd bulb will be off, but still warm.
So that's essentially the same thing that we have in this response. A little bit different pattern of doing it, but still using both visual cues and touch cues as well to solve that problem. So thinking outside the box to solve it in that way. You could do the sequence a little bit differently, but in any case, you basically have to test and feel if one was warm at some point. So yeah, you could have 1 on bright and 2 off and feel one of those 2 being warm, or you can have all of them off and see which one's the hottest versus medium versus coldest. Yeah, so those are 2 possible solutions to this. And it really does take a little bit of fluid intelligence to come up with those solutions, as well as that crystallized intelligence of knowing how light bulbs and switches work. So you can probably guess, since we're talking about middle adults being good on fluid intelligence, which group did better. So let's see which group did it the best.
Do you think you know which team won this challenge?
And the winners of our light bulb challenge are the older brains. Yeah! Bring it! Yeah!
So I don't believe all of the older participants did get it correct, and I think there was one of the younger participants that got it correct. But yeah, this is a really good demonstration of combining those different kinds of intelligences. That crystallized, you need to know what the light bulbs do, the fluid intelligence of thinking outside the box to think of, hey, I can touch a light bulb to see if it has been on recently. This reminded me of a funny story. That there was a person driving their Toyota MR2, which is a rear-engined little sports car. So they were driving it fast around a parking lot, like late at night, like trying to drift it and whatnot. The cops get called on them. the cops come, but they had already stopped driving. They were like parked, like chilling with their friends. The cop comes up and asks them if they'd been driving around. They lie. They say, no, we weren't driving around. The cop goes and puts his hand on the front of the car, on the hood, and it feels cold because it's a fairly cold night, and that's not where the engine is. So it's just reminded me of that. You do need crystallized intelligence to know that, well, that car, its engine is actually in the back. But that fluid intelligence of being able to tell in a different way of solving that problem of like touching a light bulb or touching the hood, or in this case, the trunk of a car to see if it was on. You can combine those together. This goes along with expertise as well, and maybe I'll mention those points in a minute when we get to discussing expertise. But hopefully this was fun. If you didn't come up with a solution that would work, that's all right. I didn't the first time I did this either. So work on your fluid intelligence, try to solve problems. There's different like brain games you can play to work on essentially all cognitive capacities, including fluid intelligence, if that's something that you'd enjoy doing. So let's look at some longitudinal data of different cognitive capacities. Before we do that, I have a question for everybody of what does longitudinal mean? So what is a longitudinal study? Or I guess what's a brief description of what a longitudinal study is? Some hints are on the slide. Feel free to either take over the mic or also type the answer in the meeting chat. So what is a longitudinal study?
Isn't it just a study over a long period of time?
Yep, exactly. So longitudinal studies, you follow the same group of people over a long period of time. Exactly. So in this case, the Seattle longitudinal study, it started in 1956. I think the participants were 20 when it started, and then they followed them over a long period of time. So we've got another response where researchers take a group. Yep, so researchers are researching a single group over a long period of time is a longitudinal study. Good job. And that's opposed to a cross-sectional study, is another developmental research method that we've talked about, where you take different groups at one point in time. So the Seattle longitudinal study, they followed these people from about 20 to when they died, essentially. So let's say 95. You could do a cross-sectional study where you take a group of 20-year-olds today, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 80-year-olds, and 90-year-olds and measure them all today, and you might be able to infer something about development over time or their cognitive capacities. But longitudinal research is really the gold standard because you're following the same group of people. They're alive at the same time, so same kind of history effects. That can sometimes be a weakness. So if, for example, during your longitudinal study, there's a giant world war that affects a lot of the data and affects a lot of the people in different ways, well, you can, one, see the effects of that on the people, but it might make it harder to generalize to people who didn't experience something like a world war. So there's costs and benefits with both longitudinal and cross-sectional. And we'll talk about one piece of research or findings that we found from cross-sectional that is really clarified by longitudinal. So these are the kinds of abilities tested in the Seattle longitudinal study. They tested these people's verbal comprehension at every point in time across their lifespan, their adult lifespan. They tested verbal memory, spatial orientation, inductive reasoning, perceptual speed. So these are things that increased in middle adulthood. Verbal ability, verbal memory, inductive reasoning, and spatial orientation. All those increased throughout middle adulthood. Versus numeric ability and perceptual speed, they declined in middle adulthood in this sample. So this is a really good thing to see, just the natural development of these things, the natural change. So verbal ability, verbal memory, inductive reasoning, and spatial orientation. And the reason we focus on this study specifically is it's one of the first to show that a lot of our cognitive capacities really stay maintained or even increase throughout middle adulthood. a lot of people before this study, and even just lay people today, might assume that as you get into middle adulthood, your brain capacities, your cognitive abilities are going to decline. But by and large, most of our cognitive capacities continue improving across middle adulthood or stay stable across middle adulthood. There are some losses. Most of those losses are happening towards the end of middle adulthood, though. So let's watch some other findings on some other cognitive capacities, basically summarizing some more up-to-date research here.
Aging is a natural process, and with it come changes in memory. Most people associate aging with declines in cognitive performance. My mom will say she's having a senior moment when she forgets something, for example. But never fear, not all cognitive changes in adulthood are negative. Some abilities remain relatively stable, and some even improve. So let's start with the positive. Abilities that remain stable. First of all, implicit memory stays about the same across the lifespan. In other words, once you've learned to ride a bike, that procedural memory is likely to stay with you as you age, barring any brain damage or disease. Recognition memory also stays relatively stable over time, meaning that once you learn something, your ability to pick it out of a list later remains about the same, whether you're 27 or 67. Now for abilities that improve. Semantic memory improves until around age 60 and only then starts declining. This means that older adults still have good verbal skills and why they make excellent crossword puzzle buddies. A related area in which older adults tend to score better than younger adults is crystallized intelligence, which involves the ability to use knowledge and experience. Since older adults have had more time to gain knowledge and experience, this pattern makes sense. And crystallized intelligence is often tested with reading comprehension and analogy tests. So older adults tend to be better at those than younger adults. Finally, older adults tend to be better at reasoning in the face of interpersonal or emotionally charged problems. Again, the theory is that with their greater experience and knowledge of these types of situations, they're more likely to have been through some similar situation and be able to draw from that experience. Of course, there are some.
So these stable and improving capacities, I think, are really important to point out, especially in the lifespan class. But this is something that I wish a lot more people just generally knew and understood, is that a lot of our cognitive capacities throughout the lifespan, throughout middle adulthood, stay stable or are even improving. So, and even for those things that are declining, they can be worked on. So doing specific kinds of skills, working on them, doing brain teasers, going and doing new things. There's a lot of different ways to improve your cognitive capacity and increase your abilities across these. If you want a better implicit memory, you can work on that, even if it's going to be generally staying stable. So these declines, just remember, you can improve these things that are just naturally and on average declining for people.
Some cognitive abilities that decline as we age. Recall becomes more difficult. Although recognition is stable, it's harder for older adults than younger adults to generate responses without cues, like there are in a free recall or sometimes cued recall test. Similarly, episodic memory is impaired. Often, memories formed a long time ago will be relatively stable, but forming new episodic memories becomes more difficult as we age. Processing speed slows down as we age, so if you're watching Jeopardy with Grandma, she might know just as many answers as you do, if not more, but she'll have a harder time outputting the response within such a short period of time. Related to processing speed, divided attention becomes more difficult. As we age, it becomes increasingly harder to effectively switch our attention between tasks, so we become more easily distracted. The bottom line is that cognitive changes in adulthood aren't all negative. Although some cognitive abilities do decline, it's important to remember that in healthy older adults, some cognitive abilities will remain stable.
So, and another thing that this presenter is getting at here is this is obviously barring any kind of neurological problems or developmental disabilities or things like that. So obviously someone who develops Alzheimer's might not be able to expect all of these aspects to stay stable or be improving. Even with that being said, there's a lot of applied research in cognitive psychology. As a field, cognitive psychology is one of the more applied fields in psychology, which basically means they're working on like solving problems and impacting things in the real world. So a lot of what we're describing here is like this is what happens on average for people across the lifespan. But cognitive psychologists also look at, okay, so someone who does have neurodevelopmental problems, how can we continue to improve their semantic memory even if these problems are making it go down? Or how about for these declines of like recall or episodic memory, how can we improve those? And so there's a lot of tools and skills and a lot of apps actually that do that now. So a lot of researchers have created apps and games and tools to help you improve your cognitive capacities. So whether it's something that you're afraid might decline in the future, or something that you just want to improve now, or something that you want to improve when you are in middle adulthood, like there are a lot of ways to do that. As one example, episodic memory. We've talked about this before. Episodic memories don't really exist until you're about 2.5 years old. Your neurological capacities in creating memories, that's about the earliest you could possibly create an episodic memory. But most people's episodic memories, like the first memory you can think of, is generally around like 4 or 5 years old. So we talked about that. So you develop that capacity and then it kind of just increases into about early adulthood. So we talked about most of our episodic memories that we keep long term are from late adolescence and early adulthood, when there's a lot of changes, a lot of life transitions, moving to new places, starting new jobs, going to college, meeting new partners, things like that. A lot of those memories tend to be the episodic memories that stick with us. In middle adulthood, one of the possible reasons that this might be declining is if we're just going in a routine, the same kind of job, the same kind of things every week by week. There's not many novel and new things to create new episodic memories for. That's one reason your brain might learn to not focus on creating episodic memories. So for that specifically, doing new things, new hobbies, going new places, a new trail, if you like hiking, for example, could help create new episodic memories and prevent that from declining. So there's a lot of just good other things you can do in living life to keep these capacities on a stable or even increasing trajectory. So I think that's a really positive message that I want to get to you students about middle adulthood, is that while a lot of physical capacities might be declining, especially in late middle adulthood, cognitive capacities can improve and stay stable throughout all of the lifespan, even up to the point you die. So I think that's a really positive thing, to keep and improve those capacities so you can do a lot with your mind. All right, so here is a graph from that longitudinal study that followed people from about age 20 to the point that they died. And hopefully you see here, middle adulthood starts about here and then ends about here. So most of this graph is middle adulthood. And you can see for most of these lines across all of middle adulthood, it's pretty stable. So the ability to do verbal comprehension is actually improving. Perceptual speed is pretty stable across most of middle adulthood. And so these are on average the capacities that people have when we follow them longitudinally. So if you are worried about learning or losing your perceptual speed, work on it. And we can see with a little bit of work on those things, they can stay stable across the rest of the lifespan. So I think it's pretty optimistic. Hopefully I've drilled that into your heads enough at this point that you take that out with you and maybe even share it with someone and change their perception of middle and late adulthood to a time of just being about loss to also being about maintaining and even improving cognitive abilities. So another aspect I wanted to point out, this is the graph from longitudinal findings. Let's see a graph of cross-sectional study findings. Then we'll come back to some of these. All right, went too fast. So when we look at samples of different age groups, so like 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 80-year-olds, when we look at them in a cross-sectional way, like measuring all those different groups today, we tend to find cognitive abilities that seem to be declining faster than with longitudinal studies. So there might be a couple different reasons for this. And this goes back to the problems with the methods. Some of the problems might be, well, maybe the measure we're using to test perceptual speed in an 80-year-old is not well suited for an 80-year-old to do. Maybe the measure is actually better suited for a 30-year-old, and that might account for a little bit of that increase. So it's a measurement problem. Your tool is better at measuring or more efficient at measuring younger people than older people. You could think of this in a more dramatic example. You could give, say, a high school senior a survey, ask them how much they agree or disagree with things in relation to their own creativity or something like that. You probably wouldn't do that with a 6-year-old. You probably wouldn't stick that sheet of paper in front of them and have them fill out those bubbles between agree and disagree. One, reading comprehension level, also being able to understand the words and the concepts. So the measurement tool you use should be appropriate for the sample you're looking at. So that's one problem that could be occurring here. Another is those 80-year-olds lived in a different time when we're looking at this cross-sectional data. So the purple line, these 80-year-olds, they've now lived 80 years of life, and you're measuring them at this point. Their experience is very different than the 40-year-olds that you're measuring. So the time from when they were 40 to this other sample that's 40 was very different times in history. That might be affecting it as well. So it's really interesting that we can find such dramatic differences from following the same group of people longitudinally, where they're going through the same things in history over time. They have the same measures given to them at each time. You might actually update measures. If, say, there's a better measure of creativity, you might use that instead at some point, like switch it out at this point in time. So that's one reason longitudinal studies are seen as a gold standard. It does away with some of those problems. It's not without its own problems. One of the biggest problems with longitudinal studies is people drop out of the study. So let's say you start with 2,000 people in your study. By the time you get to 60, some of those people have died. Some of those people have moved, so maybe you're sending letters or emails, but it's not going to the same account they used to be using. So your sample of 2,000, you might be down to 1,000 people now. So that's one of the biggest problems with longitudinal research is keeping in contact with those people over such a long period of time. That's not so bad if you're just doing like a 5 or 10-year study, but when you're trying to do a whole lifespan, it's really easy to lose people in that time. It takes a lot of work to keep up with them and all their moves and transitions in life. So, all right, let's take a quick break, but then when we come back, we'll talk about careers, work, and leisure in middle adulthood and how that's related to things like meaning in life, identity, and other really socio-emotional aspects of human development, even though it was placed in this chapter. All right, so let's take a quick break, be back at 10:39. So be back at 10:39 and let's do a break. All right, and we are back. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Looks like the recording is still going and the screen is still sharing. So let's get into it. Let's talk about careers, work, and leisure, purpose and meaning in middle adulthood, and we'll see if we can get all the way to an activity at the end of class. We might be too short on time, though. We'll see. So work is really central to the lives of a lot of middle adults. So a lot of middle adults are working. The stat is about 80% of people in middle adulthood are working, and this has a big impact on identity. So a lot of their time is going to be spent at work. So they're going to have it. It's going to be a place where a lot of their contexts kind of run through friends or peers. Their kind of position within, say, a company. Are they a mentor? Are they still being mentored? Are they accomplishing a lot? So a lot of that's going to be going into their identity. So with this and generativity, trying to give back to the world, it's a time of evaluation, assessment, and reflecting on their work. Have their work been doing things that they want to within the world? Have they gotten people ready for the field, for example? Are they managing well? So a lot of these aspects can go into their identity. And if they feel like it isn't, a lot of middle adults change their careers. Some of them might not feel like they have gotten to the place where they wanted to be in their career, like to the position they wanted, or maybe a salary that they wanted, or that they're not actually able to do what they wanted. So this tends to be a time where people do change their careers. So it's pretty common for people to change careers in middle adulthood. And we'll talk about, we did watch a video last time that mentioned that midlife crises aren't a thing, but that's one thing some people used to see as part of a midlife crisis, that, oh, things were going so well for you, and now you just changed your job because you weren't feeling very good about it. Well, if they're not feeling very good about it, if they're evaluating and assessing and reflecting on things, and they realize that this isn't what they want to be doing and who they want to be, then it's a very healthy thing for them to then change to do something that they might rather do. So at this time, a lot of middle adults have a lot of responsibilities on them, maybe more than we tend to think about. So things like mortgage and rent, that's probably pretty obvious. Medical bills. So we talked about how this might be a time when a lot of chronic illnesses might start to appear. So things like heart disease or cancer. So those kind of medical bills can have an impact, especially in a context where we have to pay all those medical bills and have a lot of medical debt. Home repair might be a big cost. They might be paying college tuition for their own children. They might even have parents who they have to care for. So they're caring for their parents, whether they're in a nursing home or in their own home. So there's a lot of financial as well as socio-emotional responsibilities related to being a middle adult that we might not necessarily always consider, but go into the context that they are in. So with this, this can be a challenge as well for a lot of people because of the globalization of work. So one of the easiest ways to reduce costs for companies is to reduce labor costs. And one way to do that is to, maybe downsize, restructure, outsource jobs to a place where they can pay people even less. This affects middle adults because oftentimes middle adults are kind of incentivized to retire early or to leave that position. So this is something I saw really clearly actually with my father-in-law. My father-in-law, he's in middle adulthood, maybe on that edge of late adulthood, but he had worked for the same company. It was a big aerospace company. It was essentially his first career, and he stayed with that company as they were buying out other companies, and he shifted his position a little bit within it and had promotions and whatnot, but he had been with that company many, many years. As he got to middle adulthood, there were changes in the division he was with. Most of his team he had been with also for a couple decades. So there were changes made to the structuring of the company that really were very deterring for those workers, for those middle adult workers, to stay there. It wasn't very comfortable for them to be there. That wasn't. They weren't being respected as they should have been because of all their experience and all the things that they were doing for the company. They were also given financial incentives, like, hey, if you retire a few years earlier than planned, you'll get X, Y, and Z bonuses. So things were shifted around in the company to try and encourage them to retire early and leave. And the main point of that was, well, when you've been working for that long, when you've had this many promotions, when you're doing these tasks that, yes, you're very skilled and can do them very easily, but the labor costs for you are quite a bit higher than the company wanted to be paying, essentially. And so they were trying to get these high-paid, skilled workers out so they could train more low-paid starting workers to take over those jobs. And this happens with not just my father-in-law, but a lot of middle adults experience this. Part of it's ageism, part of it's just trying to reduce those labor costs. And so in other ways, your job might just totally get outsourced to another country where you can pay people even less. So with that, it can be a big challenge for people in middle adulthood. Maybe that was their goal. They were planning to keep with that job until retirement, and now things are changing. So that's going to be part of changing their identity and changing their plan. It can be a challenging time. So most of what we're talking about here are kind of negative aspects of work, but work can also provide a lot of positive aspects. People, maybe I should go to maybe this one where someone's smiling at work. People who are working, if they're doing something that's meaningful to them, that can be a big boost. It can give them a lot of peers and social connections that they're working with. So there are a lot of potential positive benefits with working. But the point here is there are some specific challenges for middle adults that might not be faced by, say, early adults in the workforce. So other things with that additional healthcare costs, if they have good or no health insurance, that might impact career decisions as well. It might be an additional worry. They might feel like they're behind. Maybe they haven't got to the kind of position that they want. A lot of middle adults we're seeing right now are moving pretty rapidly, a lot more rapidly than we saw maybe 40 years ago. People would kind of stick with a career and stick in that company for a long period of time. Now we see people being a little more jumping around a lot more frequently, even middle adults. I'm not talking about like millennials or Gen Z here. I'm talking about middle adults, people that might even be baby boomers, for example, that they are jumping to different jobs because they don't feel like they're doing what they wanted to be doing. They don't feel like they've gotten to where they want to be in that company. So rather than trying to continue getting that promotion, they kind of promote themselves by jumping to that position at another company. So this is something that we didn't see maybe 20 years ago. So with this, a lot more middle adults tend to be more self-motivated than other age groups and intrinsically motivated in their jobs. So that can be good for both the employer and the employee. So another aspect of middle adulthood is leisure time. On average, middle adults tend to be spending more time pursuing their own activities, whether this is because they have more disposable income or a little more time, or they're realizing the importance of it. Because one interesting thing is most middle adults, one of their biggest regrets or complaints, and late adults as well, is not taking enough leisure time. So very few people in middle or late adulthood will say, oh, you know, I really wish that I had spent more time at work or I had accomplished this project at work. It might be if it's very meaningful to them, but most of them regret not taking more leisure time. So with this, more leisure pursuits, going after your hobbies, doing new things, are linked to better cognitive functioning and longer life. Some of these are correlational relationships, but some are causal relationships. So for example, if you're going out hiking, that's going to be pretty good for your health. So you're getting a direct causal benefit to your health. If you're doing new things, like let's say you've always wanted to go and explore a cave, but you never have, that can be a good way to build a new episodic memory, something new and novel and different. Things like that can be good ways to keep your cognitive capacities up. Trying to learn a new game, So these are things that can increase your cognitive performance by direct causal relationships, but this is one reason we see leisure pursuits being highly correlated with increased cognitive performance, because whatever leisure pursuit you're doing might be causing an improvement in cognitive capacities. So with this, non-leisure activities, so things like watching TV or being very sedentary, are correlated with shorter telomeres. So again, there might be some causal relationships here. It might be a bidirectional causal relationship here too. And we'll talk about telomeres in a lot more detail at the end of life chapters. Essentially what a telomere is your chromosomes are made up of basically really tightly wound DNA. So at the end of that DNA strand is a bunch of just random DNA code. You could just say it's extra. If you have a shoelace, you might get a 4-meter long shoelace when really all you need is a couple feet. Think of the telomeres as that extra bit of the shoelace. So every time you copy a cell or like multiply a cell, some of that telomere ends up getting chopped off. It is possible for humans as we replicate a cell to have something in the very middle get altered or messed up or chopped, and that tends to cause something like a tumor and cancer. But more often, we've evolved essentially those long extra bits of DNA so that as cells replicate, the mistakes happen at the ends. On those telomeres, those get shortened up. So basically, if those get too short and your cells are trying to replicate, you now start cutting into the important part of your DNA, and then everything kind of falls apart and you die. Is essentially the long and short of it. The long and short of telomeres, huh? That's really a dark joke. But yeah, that's basically what telomeres are, is that extra part of the DNA that to kind of protect you as the cells replicate. And when they get really short, you die because now your DNA gets impacted as cells regenerate. And so parts of your bodies, like organs, for example, aren't going to be replenishing and regenerating as they would normally, or muscles as well. So that's why active leisure pursuits, there's probably a bidirectional causal relationship there. We see the correlation, but there might be some causal reasons too, that your telomeres are getting shortened as well as you're being non-active. So be active in middle adulthood. It's good for cognitive performance. It's good for socio-emotional health and mental health. It's really good for physical health as well. So related to that, let's talk about religion and meaning in life. So we talked about meaning, we talked about purpose a few weeks ago in our conversations on either adolescence or early adulthood. Let's focus on some other aspects. So meaning, we'll redefine it. Meaning is something that is, essentially just, it's a tautological definition, but meaning is meaningful to you. So something that you find personally enjoyable, that kind of, you might say, calls to you, or makes you feel like you're doing something important to you. So it might be your career, maybe you're a doctor or a vet or something like that. You feel like you're doing something that's really important. It might be your family is a really common meaning, something people find meaning in. Religion or spirituality might be something that you find meaning in. The environment, another example of something that you might find meaning in. So with that being said, when middle adults find things and are doing things that are personally meaningful to them, they get these kinds of physical and cognitive benefits. So let's talk about this in relation to religion. One other aspect that people oftentimes find meaning in is a religion. So the definition psychology-wise, you might get slightly different definitions if you're looking at religious studies or sociology, but psychology definition here for religion is an organized set of beliefs, practices, rituals, and symbols. So you need all those components, the beliefs, the practices, rituals, and symbols for it to be a religion that increase an individual's connection to a sacred or transcendent other, whether that be a god or nature or whatever it is. Versus spirituality, you essentially take away the practices and rituals. You could possibly, for spirituality, still have symbols that are relevant or still have beliefs that are relevant, but religion adds those practices and rituals. So a ritual would be something that the religion itself states is like a step along a path in reaching this sacred or transcendent other, versus a practice is like, these are the health rules of the religion, or we meet on this day of the week. Those are like the practices, versus the rituals are like, I guess you could call them more kind of core components. Might not be really accurate though. And then spirituality is still that sense of connection with something sacred or transcendence, but it doesn't necessarily have to include the practices and rituals. So oftentimes someone who is religious will also be spiritual, but you could be doing, but someone could be spiritual without being religious. So with this, religiousness is the degree to which a person is affiliated with a religion. So what that means is, are they doing the rituals? Are they doing the practices? Are they following the health guidelines for a practice, or meeting up once a week or twice a week or whatever it is? Are they doing the rituals they're supposed to? Feeling a sense of connection with other believers is part of that, of religiousness. So they could be doing all the things, but not feel that sense of connection with the beliefs. So maybe they don't actually believe in a sacred transcendent other, but they're doing all the things. They would score a little lower on religiousness. And then being involved in the community of believers. So those are kind of like 3 dimensions of religiousness. So whether you're higher or lower on one, your overall score on religiousness is made up of those 3 components. So someone could be high on participating in the rituals and being involved in the community, but not actually believe things related to the religion. Someone might have really high beliefs, but not able to come and do the practices or the rituals. So you would have different religiousness scores for those different people. All right, so spirituality specifically, not just religiousness now. So spirituality tends to increase in US samples across middle and late adulthood. So for both women and men. So again, that's spirituality, not just religiousness, but they are highly correlated too. So religion is positively linked to health. So when you have a community of believers, people who probably share similar values, people that you're probably meeting up with on a fairly regular basis, that's linked to a lot of health benefits. So moderating blood pressure, decreasing cortisol and hypertension. So it helps with stress, which is one of the things we talked about, extending life, is decreasing stress. So this is one way you could do that and help decrease stress. Now that being said, there are religions and cults that do promote unhealthy practices or even dangerous practices. So that kind of goes against this positive benefit. So if your religion is having you do unhealthy things, then you're going to be canceling out those health benefits essentially. So that's kind of the point there. All right, so let's talk about meaning more generally, and I think we will be able to do our activity here at the end of class. So this is Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl was a psychologist, a researcher, and was developing therapies. During World War II, he was sent to Auschwitz, where he survived, and he actually had a physical copy of his book. I think he ended up losing all the pages by pretty early on in Auschwitz, but then he started writing notes on like scraps of paper for his book. But essentially, he was already researching meaning in life before going to Auschwitz, and that had a big impact on his ideas and theorizing about meaning in life. And so I think it's a really interesting example, because that's where a lot of the current research on meaning as well as purpose in life stems from, is Frankl. So let's watch a little bit of this video and talk about it. And the main thing I want you to think about as we're watching this is, how might meaning be different for an adolescent, an early adult, a middle adult, and what kinds of benefits would it give you at those different times in life, or how it might change your context as well.
To get back to suffering and despair, sometimes it seems that some people seem to have a much heavier load than others.
communist countries, they commit.
So are you saying that in order to find meaning, it is necessary to experience suffering?
I wouldn't say it is necessary to experience suffering. What I say is just that meaning can be found under each and every condition in life, even under the worst conceivable conditions, provided that it is a situation you cannot change. Remember, I said this explicitly. That means, provided that the cause of your suffering cannot be removed. If you can remove the cause of a suffering, say in case of a cancer, by surgery, you have to undergo surgery. If you are suffering from a severe compulsive obsessive neuroses, you have to seek psychotherapeutic help. There are, within the realm of logotherapy, for instance, certain techniques that can be applied with much success, as has been evidenced not by logotherapists but by behaviorists. And finally, if you are confronted with sociological conditions that have caused your suffering, then you are called upon to change the situation, to remove the cause of your suffering by political action, for instance. But in this respect, I would like to make another additional statement by telling you something that I, a couple of weeks ago, have...
So it goes on a little bit of a tangent here to kind of further emphasize this. Please, to kind of reiterate what he's saying, in other words, that meaning can be found in kind of every aspect of life. You can find it in suffering as well. So you can find meaning through fighting cancer. You can find meaning in this kind of situation where he's talking about, like, his specific socio-political instance is being in Auschwitz, right? But this can apply also to people in other social conditions. So in poverty, for example, you can find meaning, he's saying, in these kinds of things and work to change things. So a lot of times meaning, and a lot of Frankl's focus was meaning that drove you to do something, which now we would call that specific thing purpose. But also Frankl did realize that meaning itself, you can find things that are meaningful but don't necessarily impact the world around you. So family, for example, is one example. Well, actually, that's a bad example of something that doesn't impact. You might find meaning in spending time with family, even if you're not changing or trying to do anything with family. And so the delineation between meaning and purpose wasn't clear at this point. Now it's a little more clear. We as researchers today, looking at meaning or purpose, they're a little more separate constructs. But at this time, they were not. So that just shows a little bit of the change in the field over time. And he goes and gives a couple other examples, but I think with the time, I want to skip those now. But definitely good to look at that interview, as well as his book, Man's Search for Meaning. I think there might be a free Kindle version that you can get, actually, if you wanted to. Like, I think it might be open to be published anywhere, or go to a library. Libraries are great too. So with this, some of Frankl's most important things to human life and finding meaning in life were spirituality, freedom, and responsibility. So this was very individually focused ideas. So you can think Frankl was pretty contemporary to other researchers. Like, he came a little after Freud. He was, humanistic psych was already here, but he took on that humanistic psych piece and started looking at this specific lens. So more recent researchers, Baumeister and Vos, they talk about the four main needs, and this is more recent updated research based on Frankl's. So need for purpose. And so when they first talked about this, purpose and meaning were still kind of combined as the same idea. Values, so personal values, things that you value doing, things that are important to you in relation to living a sense of self-efficacy. And we've talked about Baumeister's work on self-efficacy before, that it's a really important component for adolescents to learn that they can accomplish things, that they can do things, and that the need for self-worth. So a lot of these are highly correlated with each other. If you are working towards your purpose, you are probably building that self-efficacy. You probably have higher self-worth. You're probably also living based on your values. So these are kind of like positive things that work together, and you could say even a positive upward spiral. So that's where some of this research on religion and meaning in life is now. So with that being said, I want us to break up into small groups for basically the rest of the class and talk about purpose and meaning in life. Right now it's fine if you're combining them. Essentially things that are meaningful can be simple activities. So you might go on a hike and that's really meaningful to you. Just going on a hike yourself isn't affecting other people, versus a purpose in life is also going to be affecting people beyond yourself, whether it's your family, the world at large, your ethnicity, something like that. So how might purpose or meaning look different in middle adulthood as compared to adolescents and early adults? So that's one of the things. Some different examples. So think about some things that might be purposeful, some things that might be similarly purposeful and meaningful in adolescence, early adulthood, and middle adulthood, as well as things that might be different at those different times. And then what challenges do you think people who don't engage in meaningful, maybe just read the question. So what challenges do you think people who don't engage in meaningful activities face in middle adulthood? So these are the two things to talk about in some small groups. Let's see how many students we've got here right now. We've got, all right, so it looks like there's 6 in the meeting. So let's send Brady, Caitlin, and Mackie to team group. Let's see, we've got group A's through G. So those 3 students jump to A through G, and then we will send Rachel, Sierra, and Tamara to group the second group. Where did they go? So again, click on Teams on your app, and you can jump into your small group. So answer these questions. I'll keep them open in the general meeting, but you'll have to flip back to the general meeting. So some things that might be meaningful or purposeful to people in adolescence, some things that might be purposeful or meaningful to people in early adulthood, some things that might be purposeful and meaningful to people in middle adulthood. And then what might it do if a middle adult isn't engaged in meaningful activities? So break up into those groups and talk about it.